What is adverse possession? That is where somebody has sectioned off or actually used a section of your land, for example, or someone else's, for their own purpose for a certain amount of time. It may be 7 years in some states, it may be longer or shorter in others. And it's where they've had established use of the property and you no longer have a right to claim it back. And or if you sell the property, the sale is actually subject to a redrawing of the lines and the boundaries. So somebody who installs a fence 5 feet too far to one side, well, if you don't say something about it, they could be establishing a partial ownership of that in several years. So you want to pay attention to that sort of thing. Adverse possession may also come up in contentious situations where somebody's lived at a property for a really, really long time and they've been promised or have something in writing that indicates that they are partial or complete owners of the property that never went through a title company, never actually got processed. And so a, an adverse possession claim has to be adjudicated, meaning it has to go through the court system. Somebody can file adverse possession against a property and it just sits on public record unless and until it's adjudicated. And a judge will declare, if you want to take it to court, a judge will declare yes or no. And generally, state statutes are going to regulate, did you have established use of it? Did you actually treat it like your own? One key thing is, did you pay taxes on it? You can have adverse possession of an entire parcel. If you're the one that's been paying taxes for 5, 10 years, something like that, you may be able to lay claim. So for those of you out there who are feeling dastardly, go ahead and build a new fence line and just encroach a little bit across the line. Annex your neighbor's property. And, uh, people can get away with way too much if they just build a fence where somebody can't see it on larger properties. Build your fence way across the line. Maybe they don't notice for 5 years, and you start a garden plot there and all that stuff so that you can establish use of the land. I think something intentional like that might get dinged, but it's meant to. It goes back to the original meaning is to protect the interests of somebody who actually established valid, legitimate use of the land, treated it like their own, and never was contested. Now, in a rural neighborhood or an urban neighborhood where fence lines go and people have their little squares and stuff like that, it still can't happen. It's less common that you can just intentionally fence without somebody noticing. Hey, I thought that was my yard. What would be the common problem is somebody doesn't realize that they actually need to file a legal notice, send a notice to their neighbor who did that and say, you do not have permission. I'm not granting that. Oh, I have a use case. I have an actual sample that's right behind me. Literally on the other side of this wall is my yard. On the other side of that is a fenced in section for horses. My neighbors on this side of me have horses. My neighbors on this side have a lot of grass. And this neighbor allowed this neighbor to put a fence physically in and through several acres of their yard that they don't want to have to mow. Now, this neighbor is establishing continued use of the property. They did not formalize it in writing and say, hey, you're on notice. You are welcome to use the land until we say otherwise. There's no grant of license or continued use or expectation of use. No matter how long you use it, we can revoke it at any time. That would be the prudent thing to do for this person. It's convenient that it keeps them from having to mow their grass, but it's these people's job to maintain the fence. And so they're going back and forth on the land, which means now there's also potential legal liability in this case for a slip and fall or a groundhog hole that they step in and break their ankle, or what if their horse breaks their ankle due to some defect in the land? So really, they should sign a release of liability and an indemnification agreement to protect this entity to say, thank you for letting us feed our horses on your grass because our land was a little bit too small. And in exchange, we're doing it at our own risk. It's just an extension of their field anyway. So it's not like they're taking additional risk by letting their horses roam a little further over in the same field. It's just fenced in, and without saying, if unless they put it in writing, 5 years from now, 7 years from now, This neighbor may have literally have no claim to the land. They may have been deemed to have given it away.
Does adverse possession also apply to if somebody were to gain access to a property, live there for a period of time unnoticed, and then all of a sudden somebody's like, okay, I'm ready to sell my property, but there's squatters in there. Would that also be adverse possession?
Yes, especially if that person moved in and started paying taxes on the land, established utilities and all the other things.
Okay.
Absolutely, it can. It might be hard for that to continue for 7 years, but
Hmm.
you know, out of sight, out of mind. If I stop receiving the tax bill, if they move in over there and say, hey, and go contact, like walk into the city or call them and say, hey, send tax bills here. And they can, and they, especially if they start keeping records of their payments.
Hmm.
And that doesn't mean that the person who owns it isn't paying a mortgage. This is a prime opportunity for people to attack vacant land and fence it in where nobody's watching, especially if you have animals or some other legitimate use for the property. Encroaching on and fencing off a section of somebody's land, because there's a lot of land investors who buy in certain areas and just hold for 5 to 10 years or longer. Okay, that is adverse possession.